Hi everyone, I'm Bob Abbey, Adult Services Librarian for the City of Forest Grove. I want to welcome you to another segment of our summer-long Festival of Forgotten Authors. Today, I want to discuss a writer whose career took off in the 1970s thanks to a trilogy of books depicting moments of crisis and decline in the history of the British Empire, and whose untimely death at the age of 44 robbed the literary world of a figure poised to become one of the most promising English-language novelists of the 20th century. Coming up, this week's forgotten author, J.G. Farrell. James Gordon, or J.G. Farrell, was born in Liverpool in 1935 to an English father and an Irish mother, and he spent much of his childhood living in both England and Ireland. Farrell began writing at an early age, first for his grade school's magazine, and then for the Oxford Opinion, while as an undergraduate at Brasenose College, Oxford, where he initially enrolled to study law. Not long after his arrival at Brasenose in 1956, Farrell was struck down by polio, and he spent several weeks paralyzed in an iron lung. Although he eventually recovered, the polio left the upper half of his body permanently weakened. After taking degrees in French and Spanish in 1960, Farrell taught in France and traveled to Africa and the United States before relocating to London. Farrell's first three novels, published between 1963 and 1967, feature contemporary settings, absurdist humor, and a healthy dose of existential dread, particularly on the part of their disillusioned male central characters. While his first two books attracted modest critical attention and earned the author a writing fellowship to study in New York for 2 years, none of these early efforts have anything like the staying power of the trio of novels that followed in the 1970s, all of which brought Farrell considerable commercial success and which formed the basis for his lasting literary reputation. The first of these books, Troubles, was published in 1970, and it won the Geoffrey Faber Memorial Prize. This enabled Farrell to spend a year in India, researching his next novel, The Siege of Krishnapur, which won the Booker Prize in 1973. As a result of that prestigious award, Farrell traveled to the Far East to work on the third and last book in the set, The Singapore Grip. In 1979, the year after The Singapore Grip was published, Farrell moved to Ireland and bought a cottage on the coast. On August 11, 1979, while fishing on some rocks, he was swept out to sea and drowned. At the time of his death at the age of 44, Farrell was working on a seventh novel, The Hill Station, which was issued posthumously in 1981. Farrell once said that the really interesting thing that happened during his lifetime was the decline of the British Empire. And each volume of the so-called Empire trilogy focuses on one decisive event in that decline, namely England's loss of sovereignty over India, Ireland, and the Far East. The second novel in the trilogy, The Siege of Krishnapur, which is historically the first in the sequence, describes the Indian Rebellion of 1857-1858 from the point of view of the British residents of the fictional town of Krishnapur. The first published novel, Troubles, is set during the last days of British rule in Ireland between 1919 and 1921, and it tells the story of Major Brendan Archer, who travels to the decaying Majestic Hotel in order to claim his bride, but who soon finds himself caught up in the Irish struggle for independence and a witness to the collapse of British rule on the island. In the third novel of the trilogy, The Singapore Grip, the action shifts to the Second World War and to the period right before the Japanese invasion of that region in early 1942. This is the longest and most intricately plotted of the three books and features a large cast of characters, including Major Archer from Troubles, who returns in a much smaller role. The Empire trilogy isn't a series, so you can read the books in any order. I'd like to talk a little bit about the first book of the trilogy, Troubles, which offers, I think, an excellent introduction to Farrell's unique approach to writing historical fiction. Now, in choosing to focus on Troubles, I'm not making any qualitative statements about the other books. They're all great and you should read all of them. But since I recently had a chance to revisit Troubles, it's a little fresher in my mind than either the Siege of Krishnapur or the Singapore Grip. Spending time on a historical novel set in Ireland in the years after the First World War and before the fight for Irish independence might not seem like your idea of an enjoyable reading experience. I get it. It's really not one of mine either. But what makes Farrell's novels so compelling, and this is particularly true with Troubles, is that they tend to focus less on the events themselves and more on the ways individual characters exist in and around those events. Farrell isn't interested in creating large historical narratives which bury his characters. Instead, he wants to explore the private experiences of his characters, to put them in situations that record their reactions and responses to things that may or may not have anything to do with the grand sweep of history. In Farrell's view, history isn't composed of treaties being signed or pincer movements in a war. It's smoke in your eyes or having a blister on your foot. Farrell zooms in on the microscopic, the particular, and the day-to-day incidental and insignificant details of life, while historical events hum along in the background, occupying a space on the periphery. We don't pick up a book like Troubles to learn the complicated history of English and Irish relations or read about the exploits of great leaders or heroic figures. We come here instead to immerse ourselves in a story with interesting characters who happen to be minor, marginal participants living their lives at a moment in time over which they have little or no control. This shift in focus allows Farrell to create a rich array of principal and secondary characters in Troubles. And this starts off with Brendan Archer, the Major, a shy, well-bred veteran of the First World War who makes his way to a dilapidated hotel on the east coast of Ireland to meet up with his fiancée, Angela Spencer, a woman he barely knows. The Major comes to the fictional village of Kilnalagh as a sympathetic outsider. And this status, I think, provides him with the opportunity to take in all of the eccentricities of Irish life and the peculiar behavior of the family in which he's about to marry with a kind of bemused curiosity. He's an ideal surrogate for the reader because while much of what he encounters at the Majestic confounds him, he doesn't allow judgment or prejudice to taint his perspective. The Major's polar opposite in this story is Edward, the offbeat and volatile head of the Spencer family, a fierce man in flannels, as he's described, with a stiff, craggy face, accurately clipped mustache, and broken nose. This latter feature, we later learn, comes about as a result of him having boxed for Trinity College. At times, Edward is opinionated, overbearing, and tyrannical. At other times, he's weak and sentimental. His views on such things as reprisals and mixed marriages and his low opinion of the Irish in general place him in opposition to the Major, who, as I said, takes a much more open-minded approach to these new surroundings. These two men end up vying for the attention of Sarah Devlin, an Irish Catholic girl who is frequently rude, self-pitying, and self-deprecating. She also has a sharp tongue, and she's not afraid to speak her mind, which is apparently the source of some friction between her and residents of Kilnalagh. Ripon Spencer, Edward's son, calls her poisonous. For reasons that are never entirely clear, Sarah is confined to a wheelchair on occasion at the beginning of the novel, but by the end of the book, she's abandoned this. The Major spends more and more time with Sarah, just as his fiancée Angela begins to fade into the background. And after Angela's death from leukemia, he falls for her completely. Edward seems to feel sorry for her, and he decides to pay her medical bills. She ends up rejecting both of them for the boorish Captain Bolton, a member of the British Auxiliary Forces who constantly belittles her and denigrates Catholics and the Irish. It's hard to know what the Major and Edward see in her, but she exercises a tremendous amount of emotional control over both men, who are perhaps drawn to her because she represents a kind of excitement they crave, but ultimately can't have. The secondary characters in Troubles add depth to the novel and help flesh out the actions of the more prominent characters. Edward's son, Ripon, falls in love with Myra Noonan, the daughter of a local Irish Catholic mill owner. Now, given the complicated nature of this relationship, Noonan agrees to meet Edward at the Majestic. Edward, who's working outside in the garden, mistakes Noonan for an elderly telegraph boy and sends him inside the hotel, where Noonan wanders the corridors in search of Edward. Meanwhile, Edward, who gets wrapped up in his own musings about politics and religion, leaves the garden and goes inside the hotel, and the two men spend several pages barely missing each other. Noonan eventually grows tired of all of this, and he leaves the Majestic in a huff. Edward looks out the window and sees Noonan making his way to his car, and he wonders if that might be old what's-his-name. Now, on the surface, this scene plays like a broad farce, but it also serves as a stand-in for the strained relationship between the English and the Irish, and the inability of two seemingly incompatible sides to recognize each other and come together over common ground. And this theme would have connected with Farrell's contemporary readers, who in 1970 would have seen resonances with the current turmoil between Protestants and Catholics in the north of Ireland. And then there's the Majestic, the large, rundown hotel that houses all of these odd, quirky, assorted individuals, and that serves almost as a character in its own right. Farrell drew on the genre of the so-called big house novel that had been popular in English and Irish fiction since the 19th century. The big house served as a symbol of stability and respectability, and it provided a base of operation for members of the Irish Protestant landowning class known as the quality. Farrell plays with the idea of permanence and stability by making the grand house in Troubles a hotel, a type of building that suggests transience, but he also populates it with a group of longtime residents, including some old women, who are allowed to occupy the hotel without paying. Farrell also taps into the conventions of Gothic fiction as a way of delineating the character of the Majestic. The hotel is dark, sinister, full of mysterious venues and strange discoveries. During his first night at the hotel, the Major notices an odd smell in his room, which upon further investigation turns out to be a rotting sheep's head stuck in a pot. The butler, Murphy, moves around the building like a wraith, often turning up and disappearing when least expected. Now, at the end of the book, Murphy wanders through the hotel, dousing it in gasoline before setting the entire building and himself on fire in an act of supreme Gothic retribution. Farrell's descriptions of the grounds around the hotel and the various rooms, chambers, and public gathering spots also create a sense of foreboding, but one which is frequently tinged with dark humor. Here, for instance, is a great example of the hotel's imminent decay. One unseasonably warm day, the giant M of Majestic detached itself from the facade of the building and fell 4 stories to demolish a small table at which a very old and very deaf lady, an early arrival for Christmas, had decided to take tea in the mild sunshine that was almost like summer. She had looked away for a moment, she explained to Edward in a very loud voice, almost shouting in fact, trying to remember where the floral clock had been in the old days. She had maybe closed her eyes for a moment or two, and when she turned back to her tea, it had gone, smashed to pieces by this strange seagull-shaped piece of cast iron. Now, given Farrell's comment about the significant role the decline of the British Empire played in his own life, it's hard not to see the crumbling Majestic as a symbol for England and the Crown's declining influence in a country that had figured so prominently in British foreign affairs for centuries. I think Farrell's main contribution was to take the genre of the historical novel, which often relies on setting at the expense of character, and to flip it on its head by focusing more on the ways individuals respond to events and to each other. As he once remarked in his depiction of Singapore, although many of its bricks are real, the architecture is entirely fantastic. And by emphasizing the fantastic and introducing elements of the comical and the absurd, Farrell offers a side-eye glance at the ridiculousness of human existence and its skewed relationship to the outside world. And I think that description of the falling letter M from the sign of the Majestic is a great example of that. Now, on top of this, Farrell's prose is both lyrical and direct, and he never fails to capture even the most fleeting of emotional experiences. One of my favorite passages from Troubles comes in the last paragraph of the novel. As he surveys the burnt-out remains of the Majestic, the Major comes across a marble statue of Venus that he had noticed on his very first day at the hotel. As it turned out, this lady of white marble was the only bride the Major succeeded in bringing back with him from Ireland in that year of 1921. But he was still troubled by thoughts of Sarah. His love for her perched inside him, motionless, like a sick bird. For many weeks he continued to think about her painfully. And then, one day, without warning, the bird left its perch inside him and flew away into the outer darkness, and he was at peace. Yet, even many years later, he would sometimes think of her, and once or twice he thought he glimpsed her in the street. I mentioned in my introductory video that dying young often accelerates the process of becoming forgotten, and this is certainly the case of J.G. Farrell. But like most of the writers I profiled in this series, Farrell never completely disappeared from view. He had his champions, many of whom spoke up on his behalf. Due to a convoluted balloting process, Troubles was ineligible for the Booker Prize in 1970, but in 2010, the novel was nominated for and received the Lost Man Booker Prize, 40 years after its initial publication and 3 decades after Farrell's death. Now, there's no way to tell what Farrell would have written if he had lived past the age of 44, though the work he left unfinished in 1979, The Hill Station, provides some tantalizing clues. It seems likely, though, that if things had turned out differently, J.G. Farrell would have earned a place of honor on the list of major English language writers. I hope you enjoyed this introduction to J.G. Farrell and the first of his so-called Empire trilogy novels, Troubles, and that you'll take the time to read it and to explore the 2 other books in the trilogy. We're slowly winding down to the end of our Festival of Forgotten Authors, and I'd love to hear about any discoveries you've made this summer, either of the writers I've profiled or ones you've found on your own. So let me know in the comments section below. And if you haven't done so already, be sure to hit the red subscribe button and click the notification bell to stay up to date on all of the great video content we're producing and sharing here. So until next time and another installment of our Festival of Forgotten Authors, I'm Bob Abbey. Keep reading.